Hi, this is Gabe from FluentForever.com. At this point, we've gone through all the sounds of Latin American Spanish. If you're using one of my pronunciation trainers, it's going to take you through all of these sounds, train your ears to hear them more accurately, and teach you the spellings that produce them. Then it'll push all of that data into your long-term memory. And if you're not, that's fine too. I made these videos to give you a passing familiarity with all the sounds of Spanish, so that when you study them in depth, they're going to feel more familiar. This will make them easier to learn. In either case, I want to show you some peculiarities of Spanish that should make the spelling system, which is generally pretty straightforward, even more sensible. We'll talk about 4 topics. First, some complexities with the letters B, D, and G, and then a few remarks on the letter R, when to pronounce voiced S and Z, and finally, word stress. But we'll start with B, D, and G, and once again, I have Christina here to help out.
Hi.
So B, D, and G produce 2 possible sounds each. The first is a kind of hard sound.
B as in bruja, D as in daga, and G as in gallo.
And the second is a softer sound.
V as in cubo, D as in hada, and R as in soga.
So how do you figure out when to make the hard sound and when to make the soft one?
Well, the general rule is that these consonants are hard when they come after an N, as in bandera, and M, as in alfombra, or after a pause.
The pause rule is the complicated one here, because it requires us to take a moment and talk about how Spanish speakers connect words together. Let's look at this sentence. When you look at each word in the sentence separately, and you take a pause before every single word, you get the following.
Cuando vamos, with a B, a la galería, with a G, de, with a D, arte.
And looking at the IPA, you see exactly what you'd see in a dictionary.
Vamos begins with a B, galería begins with a G, de begins with a D. However, you don't actually speak Spanish that way. You'd never say, cuando vamos a la galería de arte. It's cuando vamos a la galería de arte.
And if you listen really carefully to the word boundaries, the points where one word flows into the next word, you'll hear this.
Cuando vamos a la galería de arte.
Those hard B's, D's, and G's all become soft when connected to other words. So in the real world, in real speech, you'll typically only encounter the hard versions of these consonants after a period, after a comma, when someone's a little unsure about what they're saying.
Cuando vamos a la galería.
Or in those 2 special cases, after an N or an M in a word or phrase.
It's álbum de música and not álbum de música.
D and only D is also hard after the letter L.
That gives you el dado, starting with a hard D, rather than el dado.
Are these B, D, and G rules always followed by every speaker? Well, no. One of the interesting things about Spanish is that while it's very strict about its vowels, those need to be perfectly clear, it's a lot less strict about its consonants. I've heard native speakers say cubo, hada, and soga, using strong versions of each of these consonants. I've heard consonants that seem to disappear. Israel, for instance. And there are all sorts of unexpected variations you'll run into. Pollo, for instance, can be pronounced pollo, 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 and almost anything in between. Does that mean it's a waste of time to discuss the rules? Well, I don't think that's the case. I think it could be useful to know the tendencies of the language. That'll help you notice when speakers are following those tendencies or not, and generally it'll keep you more aware of what you're hearing, which will help you develop good pronunciation in the short run and a better mastery of Spanish in the long run. So that out of the way, let's move on. The rest of our discussion is a lot simpler than the B, D, and G rules. First, the Spanish R. This letter is pronounced in 2 possible ways.
R, the R trill, as in carro, and R, the R tap, as in caro.
You'll pronounce R as a trill in just a few contexts. First, whenever you see a double R in a word.
For example, carro.
Second, when it comes at the beginning of a word.
For example, roca.
And third, when it comes after the consonants S, N, and L.
As in Israel, sonrisa, and mil rayas.
You pronounce R as a tap everywhere else. Next, let's talk about S and Z. In Latin American Spanish, both of these letters almost always produce the same sound.
That's s, as in zapallo and casa.
There is one circumstance where an S or a Z will turn into a Z sound, and that's when either of these letters show up right before a voiced consonant. What I mean by a voiced consonant is any consonant that makes your vocal cords vibrate if you put your hand in your throat, like V, and N. So if you encounter a Z or an S that comes right before the letters B, V, M, N, D, or G, then the S or Z should be voiced,
making a Z sound, like in Esmeralda or Gozne.
And now we can move on to our last topic, word stress. In English, a stressed syllable can entirely change the meaning of a word. We have, for instance, incense and incense. Stress is just as important in Spanish, but fortunately, figuring out which syllable to stress is much more predictable in Spanish than it is in English. Here are the rules. Rule 1. If a word ends in a vowel, an N or an S, it will be stressed on the second to last syllable.
So that gives us casa, hospitales, and comen.
This rule ends up covering around 80% of the words you'll encounter. Rule 2. If a word ends in a consonant that isn't N or S, it will be stressed on the last syllable.
That gives us ciudad, animal, caray.
And you'll note that for the purposes of stress, Y counts as a consonant. And rule 3. Last, this is one of my favorite things in Spanish's spelling system. If a word is an exception to rules 1 or 2, you will see that clearly marked in the spelling with an accent mark.
So we can have información, fotografía, teléfono.
And that is all for word stress, and we are through. To quickly review, in this video we went through 4 peculiarities of the Spanish spelling system. The letters B, D, and G, which have a soft version, V, V, and R, which shows up most of the time, and a hard version, B, G, and D, which shows up when those letters come after an N, an M, or a pause, or in the special case of D, after an L. Then we covered the letter R, which is trilled when it comes at the beginning of a word, when it is doubled up, or when it comes after the consonants S, N, or L. It's tapped in all other situations. The letters S and Z, which sound like S in Latin American Spanish, unless they come right before the voiced consonants B, V, M, N, D, and G. And last, word stress, which falls on the second to last syllable when words end with vowels, N's, or S's, the last syllable when words end in other consonants, and elsewhere whenever the stress is clearly indicated with an accent mark on the stressed vowel. And that is all for the Latin American Spanish dialect. If you need a hand in memorizing all this and training your ears to hear it, then grab a Spanish trainer from my website, link below. You'll have all of this memorized within a couple of weeks. I'll see you next time.